Maccabri Chronicle Podcast Episode 2, History's Macabre Shadows. Warning, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence, cannibalism, and cruelty. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Introduction. Welcome back to our exploration of history's most unsettling corners. In our first episode, we examined bizarre practices like mummification parties and bleeding corpses. Today, we delve even deeper. Human history is not a comforting storybook. It is a catalog of hunger, cruelty, superstition, and scientific indifference. This hour-long episode journeys across centuries and continents to confront grim realities. Impaled bodies lining a battlefield, bones arranged into chandeliers, starving settlers driven to cannibalism, convicted killers who used arsenic to build a fortune, and a stuffed human being paraded as a museum curiosity. These stories are not designed for children. They are meant to make adults uncomfortable and to remind us that the past was often brutal and bizarre. Vlad the Impaler's Forest of Corpses. We begin in 15th century Wallachia, where Vlad III, better known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad the Impaler, used impalement as his signature method of terror. He was a voivode of Wallachia, a principality wedged between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary. Vlad's reign was marked by warfare with Ottoman forces, political rivals, and his own boyars. Impalement, a horrific form of execution in which a sharpened stake was driven through a victim's body, then planted upright so that the impaled person slowly slid down under their own weight, became his calling card. Contemporary chroniclers record that Vlad impaled thieves, traitors, and captured Ottoman soldiers alike. One story, preserved by Greek historian Laonikos Chalkokondylos, describes how in 1462 Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia only to withdraw when he encountered a forest of stakes. Chalkokondylos claimed there were approximately 20,000 impaled Ottoman corpses lining the road. Imagine riding into enemy territory and being met with tens of thousands of rotting bodies slowly sliding down wooden pikes. It was psychological warfare on a horrific scale. Not only did the display force Mehmed II's men to turn back, it cemented Vlad's reputation as a figure who reveled in cruelty. Some sources even say Vlad dined among the impaled corpses to emphasize his indifference. Vlad's terror campaign wasn't merely sadism, it was also propaganda. Wallachia was a small and often unstable principality. Vlad's gruesome punishments were meant to deter crime and consolidate his authority. European pamphlets later exaggerated his cruelty, associating him with vampirism and creating the Dracula myth. Yet the core reality remains: he weaponized spectacle. The Forest of the Impaled is a reminder that fear can be as powerful as swords or cannons. In a time when news traveled by word of mouth, 20,000 impaled bodies ensured that anyone who contemplated resisting Vlad thought twice. The Sedlec Ossuary and Europe's bone churches. From a forest of corpses we step into a chapel built from the dead. The Sedlec Ossuary in Kutna Hora, Czech Republic, looks like a Gothic church from the outside. Inside, the decorations are human bones, everywhere. It houses the remains of tens of thousands of people. In the 14th century, an abbot scattered soil from Jerusalem's Golgotha on the Sedlec cemetery, making the site sacred. Victims of plague and wars flooded the graveyard, and by the 1400s the cemetery was overflowing. When a church was built on the site, workers exhumed the bones and stacked them in the ossuary. In 1870, a woodcarver named František Rint was hired to organize the piles. Rint bleached and carved thousands of skulls and bones, fashioning them into chains, chalices, candelabras, and even a chandelier containing every bone in the human body. Visitors today gaze up at an arrangement of femurs, vertebrae, and skulls forming delicate patterns that seem both reverent and grotesque. Sedlec isn't the only ossuary. Across Catholic Europe, bones have been rearranged into art. In Évora, Portugal, monks lined the walls of their chapel with bones to remind worshippers of mortality. The Paris catacombs stand apart, however, for their sheer scale. An overcrowded cemetery threatened Parisian public health in the late 18th century, so authorities ordered the removal of human remains. Night after night, carts hauled bones to abandoned limestone quarries where they were dumped down shafts and stacked into galleries. In 1810, Inspector Louis-Étienne Hare de Thury arranged skulls and long bones into decorative walls, creating a macabre underground exhibit that opened to the public in 1809. Today, the catacombs contain an estimated 5 to 6 million bodies, making them a subterranean city of the dead. The arrangement of bones may seem artistic, but each skull represents a life. Each femur once carried a person through Parisian streets. Walking through the catacombs is like strolling through an ossified history book, an unsettling testament to how urban populations have dealt with mortality. The Donner Party, hunger's breaking point. Our next stop is the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846. Donner Party, a group of pioneers heading to California, took a new route called the Hastings Cutoff. It proved disastrous. Snowstorms trapped them in the mountains. As supplies dwindled, they ate their pack animals, dogs, and even boiled leather from their tents. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, after consuming dogs and cowhides, many emigrants died, and survivors were forced to resort to cannibalism. By the time relief parties arrived, 42 people were dead and 47 had survived. In the chaos of starvation, the line between survival and humanity blurred. National Geographic reports that survivors admitted they stored bodies in snowbanks to preserve them as a protein source when all other food was gone. Some accounts describe group votes on whether to draw lots to decide who would die. Louis Keseberg, one of the last survivors, became infamous. When rescuers reached him in April 1847, they found him surrounded by cooked flesh and bones, and rumors circulated that he had hung a young boy like meat. Keseberg insisted he only ate the dead to stay alive, but the image of a man cooking human flesh in a snowbound cabin burned into the American psyche. Archaeological excavations in the 1990s found no human bones, suggesting the bodies were consumed completely. The Donner Party story forces us to consider hunger's power to strip away taboos. It also reminds us that popular memory can vilify survivors who had no good choices. Franklin's lost expedition. Desperation on the Arctic ice. A century later, another group of explorers faced starvation on the edge of the known world. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led HMS Erebus and Terror to find the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic. The ships vanished. Search parties found only graves and abandoned equipment. Inuit testimony collected in the 1850s described white men dragging a boat across the ice and later corpses showing evidence of cannibalism. For decades, historians debated whether the Royal Navy's disciplined sailors would resort to eating each other. Modern forensic science has provided grim answers. Archaeologists have found bones from Franklin's crew with cut marks, consistent with flesh removal. Some bones were broken and polished, suggesting they were cracked open to boil out marrow, a sign of end-stage cannibalism. A 2023 study identified a jawbone belonging to Captain James Fitzjames showing cut marks, indicating that even the officers were eaten. These findings corroborate Inuit oral histories that British survivors butchered their dead comrades. When starvation looms on the polar ice, rank and decorum evaporate. The Franklin expedition shows that even highly trained men, confident in Victorian superiority, were ultimately human, driven by the same desperate hunger that haunted the Donner Party. Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. Execution methods can be grotesque, not only in outcome but in design. Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was an execution practiced in China from around the 10th century until it was abolished in 19. It was reserved for crimes considered especially heinous, such as treason or murdering one's parents. Victims were tied to a post while the executioner began by slicing off pieces of flesh, typically starting with the chest, then the arms and legs. In some cases, limbs were amputated before finally cutting the throat or decapitating the person. The Yuan dynasty stipulated 100 cuts. Some records from the Ming dynasty describe thousands of cuts. Execution could last hours or even days, with the condemned person dying slowly from blood loss and shock. The aim was not just to kill but to humiliate and terrorize. Bodily fragmentation was thought to prevent the victim from having a complete body in the afterlife. Lingchi's abolition came after international outrage. In 1905, a French soldier photographed an execution, distributing the image in Europe. The resulting uproar embarrassed the Qing dynasty and contributed to the practice being banned. The photograph shows a man tied to a post, his torso carved into strips. Even on grainy film, the suffering is evident. Lingchi reminds us that the law itself can be turned into torture and spectacle. By stripping away a person piece by piece, the state demonstrated its absolute power over the body. The method's long history suggests that ritualized cruelty can persist for centuries until public revulsion, and global scrutiny finally ends it. Scaphism, eaten alive by insect. If Lingchi relied on blades, Scaphism weaponized nature. According to ancient Greek writers like Plutarch, Scaphism was a Persian execution method, though some historians question whether it was actually practiced. The description is terrifying. The condemned person was trapped between two boats or hollowed tree trunks so that only their head, hands, and feet protruded. They were force-fed milk and honey, causing violent diarrhea. Executioners then poured milk and honey over the victim's body, smearing it on exposed skin. This sickly sweetness, combined with excrement, attracted insects and vermin that burrowed into the flesh. Bound and immobilized, the person could not swat away flies or maggots. As Plutarch tells it, Mithridates, an officer who insulted King Artaxerxes II, was punished this way and survived for 17 days, slowly being eaten alive. Death came from dehydration, septic infection, and shock. Whether Scaphism existed or was a cautionary tale, its imagery resonates because it turns the victim into a living corpse. The executioner need not wield a blade. Nature itself, insects, rod and sun, becomes the instrument of torture. In an era before antibiotics, the idea of being consumed by worms while conscious would have been nightmarish. Scaphism shows that humans have used everything from knives to mosquitoes to express cruelty. Burke and Hare, murder for profit. Our journey next leads to the grim alleyways of Edinburgh in the late 1820s. Medical schools needed corpses for dissection, but the supply from executed criminals was limited. Grave robbers known as resurrection men exhumed bodies and sold them to anatomists. William Burke and William Hare took the trade further. A lodger in Hare's boarding house died owing rent, so they sold his body to Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy school. Realizing the profit to be made, they began murdering vulnerable people to sell the bodies. Over 10 months, they killed at least 16 people by suffocation, a method later called Burking, and delivered the fresh corpses to Knox. The victims were drifters, sex workers, and the poor, people unlikely to be missed. The murders unraveled in November 1828 when lodgers discovered a body hidden under straw. Hare turned king's evidence, testifying against Burke. William Burke was hanged on 28 January 1829, then dissected and his skeleton displayed in an anatomy museum. Dr. Knox, who had paid for the bodies, was never tried, but his reputation was ruined. The case shocked Victorian Britain and prompted the Anatomy Act of 1832, which provided legal means for medical schools to obtain cadavers without resorting to body snatching or murder. Burke and Hare exemplify how scientific demand can create a market for crime. Their story also reveals society's indifference toward the poor. Because their victims were marginalized, the killers operated for months without detection. The Paris Catacombs. Millions underground. We have already glimpsed bone churches, but Paris deserves its own segment. By the mid-1700s, cemeteries like Saints Innocents in central Paris were overflowing, leading to miasmas and disease. Authorities decided to transfer remains from overcrowded cemeteries to abandoned quarries. Starting in 1785, bones were removed at night in funeral processions accompanied by priests, then dumped down wells and galleries of the quarries. Transfers continued for nearly 30 years, so by the time the Paris municipal ossuary, the Catacombs, opened to the public in 1809, it contained millions of bones. Later, Inspector Haricard Báthory transformed the ossuary into an attraction by stacking skulls and long bones into patterns. The catacombs hold an estimated 5 to 6 million people, more than the population of many countries. Walking through the cool tunnels, seeing row upon row of skulls, one is struck by the sheer mass of human mortality. Each face is anonymous. Some belong to medieval peasants, others to aristocrats. A plaque might tell you the bones were moved from the Madeleine Cemetery in 1792, but individual identities dissolved into collective anonymity. The catacombs also reveal the intersection of public health, urban planning, and morality. Officials removed remains under cover of night so as not to offend sensibilities. They consecrated the ossuary in 1786, acknowledging that even mass graves deserve religious respect. Today, the catacombs are a tourist site, yet they remain a tomb. Visitors are reminded to keep silent out of respect for the dead. The labyrinth is a physical manifestation of how cities manage death when land is scarce. It also invites reflection on our own transient presence above these hidden worlds. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. Turning from burial practices to living cruelty, we confront Countess Elizabeth Báthory of Hungary. Born into a powerful noble family in 1560, she married soldier Ferenc Nadasdy and lived at Countess Castle. Rumors of her sadistic behavior circulated among peasants and nobility. According to a National Geographic examination of the case, Báthory is often called the most prolific female serial killer, accused of murdering more than 600 young women. Legend claims she bathed in virgin's blood to preserve her youth, though this part of the story may be later invention. Her husband reportedly coated a servant girl in honey and left her outside to be ravaged by insects, and he gave Elizabeth gloves with claws to scratch and tear her victims. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation after reports of disappearing girls. Witnesses described bodies drained of blood, girls burned with hot irons and beaten with clubs. Officials searching the castle allegedly found dead and dying girls in the dungeons. Elizabeth was arrested and charged with the murder of about 80 women, although some witnesses claimed the number exceeded 600. Because of her noble status, she was never tried. Instead, she was walled up in a room in her castle, with only small slits for food and air. She remained there until her death in 1614. 4 of her servants were executed. The Blood Countess story demonstrates how power can shield perpetrators. It also shows how folklore can magnify real cruelty into legend. Whether Elizabeth bathed in blood or not, she inflicted horrific torture on vulnerable girls and was partially protected by her rank. Her name remains synonymous with vampiric aristocratic evil. Unit 731, Science Turned to Slaughter. Human cruelty can masquerade as research. During the Second World War, Japan's Kwantung Army operated Unit 731, a secret biological warfare program in occupied Manchuria. Officially described as a water purification unit, it consisted of more than 150 buildings in a complex near Pingfan. With a staff of over 10,000 people, Unit 731 carried out experiments on Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and other captives. General Shiro Ishii and his team deliberately infected victims with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other pathogens. Subjects were vivisected without anesthetic to observe disease progression, limbs were amputated, organs removed, and bodies frozen to study hypothermia. Fleas bred in Unit 731 were dropped in ceramic bombs over Chinese cities to spread plague. According to historian Tsuneshi Keiichi, documentation exists for at least 850 victims killed by 1943, and specialists widely accept that about 3,000 people were exterminated at Pingfan. Because Japanese forces destroyed many records before surrendering, the true death toll may be higher. Unit 731's experiments have been described as some of the worst war crimes in history. Survivors recall watching friends strapped to tables and dissected alive, begging for mercy. After Japan's defeat, many Unit 731 leaders were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. Victims were denied justice, and much of the world remained unaware of the horrors for decades. The program demonstrates how scientific curiosity, when unmoored from ethics, can descend into atrocity. It also serves as a warning that wartime secrecy can hide unimaginable cruelty. Mary Ann Cotton, Arsenic and Insurance. Victorian England had its own serial killer cloaked in respectability. Mary Ann Robson, born in 1832 in County Durham, married William Mowbray in 1852 and moved frequently. They had at least 3 surviving children. Others died from what was called gastric fever, a common ailment whose symptoms mimicked arsenic poisoning. William took out a life insurance policy covering himself and the children. After William and 2 children died in the early 1860s, Mary Ann collected the payout and remarried. Her second husband, George Ward, died within a year. She then married a third man, James Robinson. Several of his children died. He refused to take insurance, and he eventually left her. Mary Ann soon remarried yet again, but husbands, lovers, and children continued to die. By 1872, suspicion fell upon her when her 7-year-old stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, died, after she reportedly remarked, "I won't be troubled long." An examination found arsenic in his stomach, and exhumations of previous victims revealed arsenic as well. At her trial in early 1873, the defense argued that the victims could have inhaled arsenic from wallpaper dye. Arsenic compounds were indeed common in Victorian wallpapers. The jury was unconvinced. Mary Ann Cotton was convicted of murdering her stepson and was hanged on 24 March 1873. The execution was clumsy, the drop was too short, and the hangman had to press down on her shoulders until she suffocated, taking 3 minutes. She never confessed, but estimates of her victims range up to 21 people, including several of her own children and at least 4 husbands. Mary Ann's story exposes how easily a seemingly ordinary woman could exploit life insurance in an era when forensic science was rudimentary. It also demonstrates the casual ubiquity of arsenic, found in wallpaper, toys, and candy, making poisonings hard to detect. Mary Ann Cotton is sometimes called Britain's first female serial killer, a grim title she shares with the Blood Countess on the continent. El Negro, the stuffed man in the museum. One of the most disturbing intersections of colonialism, racism, and curiosity involves a man known only as El Negro. In 1830, 2 French taxidermists, Jules and Jean-Baptiste Verreau, traveled through southern Africa collecting animal specimens. According to historian Marika Hendrickson, the brothers exhumed the body of a young Sandman, stuffed his remains, and mounted him as if he were an animal. The Time magazine account says they polished his light skin black so he would appear more African, then displayed him in a museum in Banyoles, Spain. For more than a century, the corpse stood behind glass, labeled the Bushman of the Kalahari. Locals became attached to the exhibit. When controversy arose in the early 1990s, there were campaigns to keep him, and commemorative chocolates featuring his likeness were even issued. International pressure eventually forced his removal. In 2000, El Negro was reburied in Botswana, though the choice of country was probably wrong. Research suggests he originally came from near Cape Town. Even his reburial was mishandled. The Guardian reports that his spear was left behind in Spain, his skin remained in Madrid, and his grave in Botswana was neglected, used by local footballers as goalposts. Some activists argue he should be exhumed again so his remains can be interred in his actual homeland. The tale of El Negro is not only horrifying because a human was treated as a taxidermy specimen, it also shows how racism allowed European audiences to normalize his display. He became a curiosity, a piece of colonial exoticism. Only at the turn of the 21st century did his dignity begin to be restored, and even then incompletely. The dancing plague, mass hysteria in Strasbourg. Our next story feels like something from magical realism, but is all too real. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into a street in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, and began to dance. She reportedly danced for days without rest, collapsing only to sleep briefly before resuming. Within a week, more than 30 other people were similarly afflicted, and within a month, as many as 400 people danced uncontrollably. City leaders were baffled. Instead of restricting the dancers, they believed the cure for what they called hot blood was more dancing. Authorities provided guild halls, hired musicians and professional dancers to accompany the afflicted, but this only exacerbated the outbreak. Some dancers collapsed and died from exhaustion, heart attack, or stroke. The bizarre phenomenon lasted roughly 2 months, tapering off in September. What caused the dancing plague? Contemporary witnesses suggested demonic possession or divine punishment. Modern scholars have proposed various explanations. One theory is ergot poisoning, rye bread contaminated with a fungus that produces LSD-like convulsions. Sociologist Robert Bartholomew argued that the dancers were members of a heretical sect engaging in ritual. The most widely accepted explanation, advanced by historian John Waller, is that the dancing was a form of mass psychogenic disorder. Strasbourg in 1518 faced famine, disease, and extreme stress. People believed that Saint Vitus could curse them with compulsive dancing if he were not properly honored. Under such conditions, a single person's frenzied movements could trigger a collective trance. The dancing plague illustrates how social and psychological pressures can manifest in physical behavior, and how authorities may exacerbate crises when they misunderstand their causes. It is also a darkly comical reminder that history contains mysteries that defy easy explanation. Jamestown, survival cannibalism in the New World. Our final tale returns us to starvation, but in a colonial context older than the Donner Party. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was England's first permanent settlement in North America. By the winter of 1609-1610, known as the Starving Time, the colonists were besieged by drought, hostile relations with the Powhatan people, and a lost supply ship. Food stores ran out. George Percy, president of Jamestown at the time, later wrote that colonists ate horses, dogs, cats, rats, mice, and even boiled leather, and when famine deepened, they dug up corpses and ate them and licked blood from their weak companions. For years, historians debated whether these accounts were exaggerated propaganda. Then archaeology provided confirmation. In 2012, researchers at Jamestown unearthed the fragmented skull and tibia of a 14-year-old English girl dubbed Jane. Forensic analysis by the Smithsonian revealed 4 shallow chop marks on her forehead, tentative attempts to open the skull, followed by deeper blows that split the cranium and allowed the brain to be removed. Sharp cuts on the jaw indicated efforts to remove cheek meat and the tongue. The cut marks were hesitant, suggesting the butcher was inexperienced. This was the first direct evidence of cannibalism at a European colonial site in North America. National Geographic reports that archaeologist William Kelso had previously doubted the cannibalism stories, but he now accepts them. The discovery confirms that Jamestown's colonists, like the Donner Party, crossed a taboo line to survive. The context amplifies the horror. Roughly 80% of Jamestown's colonists died during the starving time. Most were aristocrats and gentlemen unaccustomed to farming. They arrived during one of the worst droughts in centuries and lacked relations with the Powhatan. Their desperation is captured in the marks on Jane's skull, tentative, awkward, and yet purposeful. A girl who had likely arrived only months earlier became food for her fellow settlers. Jamestown's cannibalism forces us to confront the brutality of colonization and the extreme risks early settlers took. It also shows that hunger can override all moral and religious injunctions, regardless of time period. Conclusion: history is a mirror reflecting both the heights and depths of human experience. In this episode, we have traversed a landscape of cruelty, desperation, and macabre curiosity. Vlad the Impaler weaponized terror by impaling thousands. Churches and catacombs turned bones into decoration, reminding the living of their mortality. Starving pioneers and sailors resorted to cannibalism. Executioners prolonged suffering through Lingchi and perhaps Scaphism. Body snatchers murdered for profit. Serial killers like Elizabeth Báthory and Mary Ann Cotton hid behind nobility and domesticity. A colonial exhibition displayed a stuffed human being like an animal. Mass hysteria made people dance until they dropped. And in the starving colony of Jamestown, desperate settlers butchered a teenager. These stories are unsettling because they reveal what ordinary people will do when confronted with hunger, fear, power, or superstition. Studying such episodes is not a morbid exercise for its own sake. It reminds us that humans are capable of both compassion and cruelty. It urges us to build social systems that prevent starvation, abuse, and dehumanization. And it forces us to question whether any era can claim moral superiority when the capacity for horror remains constant. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into history's Maccabri Chronicle. Join us next time as we uncover more disturbing facts from the past. Until then, sleep with one eye open.